All right, we are back on the podcast where we are training men in spiritual fitness. And I am Evan McGinty here with my friend Joe Barnard. Joe, well, what's going on in Scotland right now?
What's going on in Scotland? Uh, nothing particularly exciting. I'm trying to think of something, if the haggises are like running loose right now, or, but there's nothing really worth reporting. So,
It's very boring in
life as
Scotland.
usual.
Very, very boring. Okay, thank you. I'm inspired. This is great. There's nothing exciting going on down here in Louisiana either. Don't worry. It's okay for it to be seemingly boring. That's a good life. It's a good life.
That's right.
Um, so we've been for the past few weeks talking to guys about masculinity. What does it mean to be a man? And I've enjoyed these conversations so far. And the way we're doing this is by taking a book and reading it, you and I, and then discussing it and trying to figure out, okay, where can we gain wisdom? Where is the good insight out there on this journey to figuring out exactly what does it mean to be a man? And so the book we've got this week that you and I read is by this old dead guy, J.C. Ryle. It's called Thoughts for Young Men. So it's a little bit of a different angle in the sense that this book is particularly aimed at young men and trying to form and shape and maybe correct some of the actions and thought processes of young men. But I think it's very applicable even for guys in their 40s or 50s. Because you may be in that season where you're raising young men, but also, look, we're all. If you're listening to this, then you are on some sort of journey of trying to figure out, okay, what is masculinity? What does it mean to be a man? And so we need to listen to any advice we can find. But let me just, I guess, get this started by saying, give me your general thoughts, overview about this book, Thoughts for Young Men. Why did you choose it? And yeah, why do you think it's worth discussing?
This is a classic, and it's a classic guys need to know about. Partly because J.C. Ryle, he's got a wonderful masculine tone, and what I mean is he's direct. He's not harsh. There's a kind of humility, but nonetheless, he doesn't waste words. And this really isn't even a book, it's a booklet. And
Yeah.
I think if guys are, in a sense, wanting a manual for spiritual growth, whether to discuss among friends or if they just want something that's very concretely going to tell them or answer the question, how do I grow as a Christian man? I mean, this book, it's concise, it's practical, and it's time tested.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, for us, it picks up on something that's been a point that we've talked about, but not the theme of any of our discussions. And that's that growing into a man should be growing into godliness.
Yeah, that's it. And I think the way I'd like to walk through this booklet, you're right, it is book. It's like, look, if you can read this in honestly like an hour. I mean, it's short. And what I love about J.C. Ryle is he kind of just w writes in bullet points. It's like it's very, very direct and explicit, as you say, but still really rich. So I just kind of want to walk through some of his bullet points that he's offering young men here, and we can just interact on them. He kind of starts this book by talking about some reasons why it's important to address young men in particular. Just trying to give his readers, hey, here's the why. Here's why I wrote an entire booklet just for young men. So, what stood out to you in that section as he's saying, hey, here's why we need to talk about being a man to young men?
Oh, I think so much of it is just evident that guys don't really change. That
Mm,
culture has affected us in some ways. In some ways, our problems are the same. He starts out by saying that young boys, they're the ones that the families have the most trouble with. And we've got a website, Men Need Help, and it's like men have always, for whatever reason, needed more help in some ways,
uh,
more prone, in some ways to make destructive choices earlier on. And so he's just identifying the realistic need among young men and saying these are years that either can be investment for your future. So
mm,
as other books we've read, say that the child is the father of the man.
mhm,
That very much who you become is determined by who you are as a young person.
yeah,
But equally, the kind of mistakes that you make, they often carry on. So
mm,
you can have a burden of shame and frustration later in life due to either missing the opportunity of youth or making poor choices. And so it's such a formative time. that young guys, rather than the cultural narrative of I've got a decade, I've got a couple of decades just to basically spend freely. No, these are years that are so important to invest in growth and godliness.
Yeah, I think it was so important for him to start there by talking about, hey, why address young men in particular? Because although he uses, yes, some generalizations, you can't avoid using some generalizations when we start talking about, what particularly why address men and what kinds of men. I think it's helpful in realizing and waking up, wait, there is something about men and young men in particular and where we find ourselves and why it is that this is even a hot topic in today's, culture. And so I think part of what he says is, look, to be a man means that you are in a special class of people who are generally known to be absent from church, to be, filling our jails, to be filling our bars, to be leading the way in mobs. He says these things explicitly. And you know what? He's right. When you think about it, it's like who is absent from church most of the time? It is the young men. Who are the people that are often in filling in the jails and such? Yeah, it is the young. So I think in part to be a man is to admit and to recognize your need for direction and discipline.
Yeah.
And that's part of what he's addressing here. And I think for all of us, no matter our age, part of being a man is just to admit, hey, you know what? We do have problems. We have a problem, and I need to admit myself, I need direction in my life. I need discipline in my life because without that, then yes, I become like all the other young men who are absent from church or become on a straight path or end up yes in jail or at the front of a mob or something like that. So yeah, I think why do we address men particularly? We got issues, Joe. We got issues.
Yeah. I think going back to the question, why read J.C. Ryle? It's if we sometimes have that question, like if I could have you could have dinner with one person, who would it be? And you often think of
Mm,
like the rich famous person or whoever your idol is. But if you actually just were a guy interested in spiritual growth and had a list of questions and a
mm,
list of frustrations, and you could pick one guy to have dinner with and just ask all your practical questions about spiritual life, like this is your guy. I mean,
yeah,
honestly, he's got such wisdom. And I think again,
yeah,
that's why guys they need to take this up and read it.
yeah. One of the things that struck me in his kind of towards the beginning of the book that I really loved, because you're right, I'd love to sit and have dinner with him and talk more because he just gets so to the point so quickly. But he was talking about how young men are just in denial of death and just the shortness of life and this problem of putting things off. He put it this way. He said, young men have holy intentions planned for tomorrow. I'm like, oh gosh, have I been there? Am I still there? So we have these best of intentions of growing in godliness tomorrow. Like we put it off because we got time and we've got nothing but time. And there is this problem that we see with young men of I will. I don't know if you hear that at all in your house, Joe. Like I hear that a lot from my sons. You ask them to do something, I will. Take out the trash. I will. I will. Like I'll do it. I'll do it later. I've got time. I will. But I think he does such a good job of getting at the fact that that bleeds into our spiritual lives, that bleeds into all of life. This attitude of I will later, like I got time. There's all the time in the world. One of the problems of growing up and maturing and becoming an older man is you realize time is gone and all that time you wasted that you could have been growing in godliness, that all that time you should have been, giving forgiveness, all those things. So yeah, just so much to be had there.
And I think, yeah, just the problem is responsibility doesn't wait for readiness. And
Ugh.
so, if you've not done it, then you have the child or you are married. And there's some things that, you can wait, to, visit that place you've always wanted to go to. And there's no problem if that's 20
Mm,
years later, but you
mhm,
can't wait to prepare to be a father, for
mhm.
example. That's got to start now.
Yeah. So let's drill down particularly on this idea of godliness as the true pursuit of masculinity. I think that yeah, one of the thoughts I had that crossed my mind as I was reading this is that question, okay, when do you feel most masculine? If you ask a group of guys, and I'd encourage you, ask a group of guys, when do you feel most masculine? We generally would say, there's some guys that would answer when they're doing something that seems, manly, like, oh, I was fixing a car.
Hold an axe. Yeah.
Yeah, I was holding an axe. But really, honestly, ask a group of guys of your Christian friends because you'd be surprised by some of the answers. There are times when I've heard guys, it's when I finally confessed that deep hidden sin. It's when I'm walking and talking with God in the woods. It's when I'm seeking forgiveness from my wife after a fight. There's those times in my life, and I've identified this with friends that that's when they felt the most masculine. And I think that's part of what Ryle is trying to connect here, that there is something very masculine about the growth of godliness and being on the path of godliness. That's his call to young men is, hey, you want to come and be a man, get on the path of godliness. And I think you mentioned, and I'd like you to talk a little more about this, that part of the trouble with being a young man is that we put this off, some through our youth, but you could avoid a lot of pain and sorrow that comes later in life and at our age if you just get on that path of godliness earlier and set some healthy habits now. I don't know, did you connect a lot with that section?
Yeah, I think there's a way in which, and I want to be very careful in saying this, but some of how we preach grace doesn't do justice to the lingering effect of sin.
Yeah,
So, what I mean by that is certainly not that in some way we're not forgiven. I mean, the grace of God forgives us, and it's amazing. Every day is a new
yeah,
day in the sense that, we stand on that righteousness as a free gift of through Christ. That doesn't mean, though, that every act doesn't leave a trace in our memory that
mm,
often weighs down the conscience and that, in a sense
mhm,
gives ammunition to Satan. It doesn't mean that we don't fail to cultivate some talents that make us
yeah,
less useful later in life, that there is a cost to sin that lingers. And I think Ryle, he's honest enough to put this before young men. And really, he wants them to wake
yeah,
up and to feel the danger, the threat of sin. But equally, there's some wonderful things. He talks about how important it is for young men to realize they can start serving God now. That
yeah,
it's not just what you avoid, but what you can become. And the amazing things that um, you look at David, you look at Jonathan, you look at young men in the Bible that are already exemplifying great courage and great faith. And the same can be true for guys today. And so I think it's that feeling both sides. So all of a sudden masculinity feels like a weighty gift. It's precious, it's
yeah.
valuable, and I need to make sure that I invest it well starting early in my life.
Yeah. You mentioned there that, yeah, there are certain particular dangers for young men, that young men do face dangers and that they've got to be careful. And he actually has a whole section on this
Yeah.
in the book, just like helping guys figure out what are the dangers that young men face. What was there any of those that stood out to you in particular that you think are worth mentioning?
Oh, I think again that they all have relevance. I mean, he talks about pride and uses
Yeah.
Rehoboam. You might remember Rehoboam ignores the counsel of the wise older counselors and goes to his peers, and they give him terrible advice. I mean, the kingdom ends up splitting because of it. And that feeling that like I know what's best, and I'm not going to listen to any of the wisdom of those that went before me. Or he talks about the danger of love of pleasure and has
Hmm.
has a wonderful way of talking about how we can evaluate wholesome pleasure, that every pleasure is a warrant and a measure.
Huh.
Not all is licit, not all is okay. So you got to make sure it's first okay. But even if it's okay, how much of it you can indulge in is a question. It's got to be moderated in some way. And then the one that I think really just demonstrates the way times don't change as much as we think they do. Not in these words, but he talks about the problem of mindless drift, the fact that guys
Mhm.
don't think, and
Yeah.
that he says in some cases a lot of men are damned for want or for lack of thinking, and I think
Mm.
that's especially among young guys to become someone who's reflective in a good way is necessary for godliness.
Yeah, I connected a lot within this section as he was talking about, you mentioned the pride piece of the dangers for young men. What I thought was funny is here he is, he's got this whole book on, thoughts for young men. But what young man is reading this? Honestly, like the guys that are reading this are middle-aged. Like it's middle-aged guys that are reading this book about thoughts for young men, and it just is self-evident the pride that men have in their heart at an early age, that we don't listen to the advice of older people, that we don't want to. But I think that is something that over time, a lot of men who are on the path of godliness begin to do is they begin to listen and they want to read books like this. They want to know, okay, give me some advice, give me some help. I recognize my life is in danger. I realize there are dangers around me. I realize there's difficulty around me. I'd like help with that. But that is something that young men, yeah, he's got this whole booklet aimed at young men who, honestly, these days, no, I don't know. Young men aren't reading this book, and I think they should. But there is that
Yeah.
pride, and there is those bad habits, and all those things that kind of get in the way there. So yeah, it's but I think that's part of the, hey, how do you become a man? It's that art of listening and taking advice and taking on the coaching from others. Which that kind of, okay, that leads me to that next section of the book. He's got another section. I label this like time with Coach Ryle. This is what I, this is like the coaching tips. If you could sit, yes, like you said, and just have lunch or sit at a coffee table with a group of guys. I'd say this is Coach Ryle's kind of speeches to you, his counsel to you. So, was there anything in those sections that you think is worth highlighting for guys?
I thought it was interesting that he's targeting a need that we very much have felt with cross training. And
Mm,
so part of what we've tried to do is create resources to fill gaps. There's lots of resources, but one of the things that we've identified as an area where men don't get much instruction is the whole problem of sin and how you combat sin. And so one of our resources is a book on fighting sin.
mhm,
And a lot of what he says has to do with that problem. And I mean, I certainly, I look back and, knew sin was bad.
mm,
Um, but I don't know how much instruction I would have had to um, begin to try to actively fight against temptation. And so I think it's helpful and I think that's something that, again, talking about older guys that may stumble on this book,
mhm,
um, if you just want some simple advice in growth and godliness, what it looks like to follow Jesus, what it looks like to begin to see the evil of sin and actually stop loving it, then it's sort of a general framework for everyday growth in the context of a live spiritual battle.
yeah. Yeah, what I heard from Coach Ryle was, yes, that he didn't, shy away from the idea of, hey, you've got to see the evil of sin and run from it and flee temptation and yeah, get in your life these, even just, yeah, the mindset of what it looks like to identify
Yeah.
the small sins and see that they're a big deal. But I also heard just the idea of relationships stuck out to me a lot. Like relationship with Jesus. Like he did not bow down
Yeah.
from that. And I think we can't. Like, gosh, when we're
Yeah.
instructing young men, when we're thinking about ourselves and counseling our friends and coaching our friends, if we don't at some point get to the fact that, man, what are you doing to connect with Christ? What are you doing to pursue Christ? Like, there's got to be something there. Get to know Jesus. Get to know Jesus.
Yeah.
That's something that I think as a man we need to hear and we need to do. So just that relationship aspect of you've got to get to know Jesus personally. This is something you have to pursue. But then also that idea of relationships and community. He had I got to read his quote on friendship because I'm marking it. You know me, I love good spiritual friendship, but he has such a great one. He says, "Never make an intimate friend of anyone who is not a friend of God." And I was like, oh man, that
Mm.
is such good advice for young men. Specifically that intimate friendship part. I understand, yes, we need to have friends of all types and be, evangelistic, but never make an intimate friend of someone who isn't themselves a friend of God. And yeah, it again doubles down on what he's aiming guys towards here. You want to be masculine, you want to be a man, get on the path of godliness, and then surround yourself with other men who are on the same path. This is what manhood looks like. And it's just such a good and such a clear picture, I think, for men of masculinity. What else? Anything else that you found helpful in those, you know, counsel or the coaching tips for for young men?
Yes. I find some of the archaic language actually really helpful. So, for example, he says, reappraise the value of your soul.
Mm,
And I don't think we don't talk that much about the soul anymore. And it's fraught with dangers. I mean, there's ways in which you can elevate the soul and, treat the body as if it's of no significance. But that doesn't tend to be the problem of people today.
Yeah.
We tend to not have that eternal horizon, and it's particularly hard when you're young because you really do feel like life's going to go on forever.
Hmm.
But the fact is, we're not promised any amount of time.
Yeah.
And to realize that there is a difference between things that have eternal value and things that
Hmm.
are going to be, frivolous and passing, and that should evaluate even, I think, of something as looking at young guys, and you just think of video games, for example,
Yeah.
something that a form of entertainment that really does nothing to cultivate much in terms of deep relationship, much in terms of any of the faculties God's given, the mind, the heart, the will. It's no investment in your future. It's just investing in the passing fun of a moment.
Hmm.
And that's the sort of thing. Are you treasuring your soul if you're pouring endless hours into something like that? And if not, then why would you make that choice? And I think that's Ryle would push us to think about the weight that every moment could have if we have that bigger horizon in view.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like without saying it, he's basically aiming young men. Who are you becoming? If you continue down this path, doing these things, who are you becoming? What sort of man do you want to become? And you need to aim your life and your in that direction of godliness. And yeah, he even talks a lot about habits. And hey, what sort of
Yeah.
habits do you have as a young man that will, transform into your habits as an older man? And so you've got to be careful. You've got to be very, very careful. Yes, if you're setting the habit of hours video games every day, it's not like you're going to just wake up with three kids, one day and all of a sudden be like, oh, I don't like video games anymore. No, these habits stick. And so it's finding those thresholds. We talk a lot about, hey, identifying. I think even at an early age, identifying some personal thresholds to live by that set you within the bounds of the most free life on the path of godliness. Um, all right, so I think he had one last section. Oh yeah, it's like special rules for young men. It's similar to kind of his, coaching points. But was there anything else in that section or towards the end of the book that you'd say, let's hit on this before we close out?
I think I would just encourage guys to Google J.C. Ryle.
Yeah.
This links up. He's got a classic work on holiness called by that name. And I think what guys need to know is so J.C. Ryle was a leader of kind of the evangelical Reformed church in the United Kingdom in the 19th century. So his credentials are impeccable. I mean, if
Yeah.
you've heard of Spurgeon, if you like Spurgeon, you'll like J.C. Ryle. But what J.C. Ryle does so well is without at all compromising grace. He's not afraid to talk. You've
Mhm.
already mentioned habit. He's not
Yeah.
afraid to talk about effort.
Yes.
And some of these
Yes.
things that are often missing in our discussions of how you grow in godliness or sanctification, I think guys will be really surprised at the depth, at the accessibility, but also at the challenge that comes with J.C. Ryle. So I would say find this book, read it, and then if you like it, go find a copy of Holiness.
Yeah. No, I hate to end a podcast by giving about a book by giving more book recommendations, but I'm totally going to do that because yes, I agree that the Holiness book that you mentioned, I'm in the process of reading that right now, and it's rocking my world. It's so good, so clear, so gracious in his approach, and yeah, I'm really enjoying it. But I'd recommend Surviving the Trenches. Your book, Joe, on how to fight sin. I think that it fits nicely with what Ryle is pointing to. What does it mean to be a man? I think this idea of having a strategy for sin and temptation. Have you even thought about that? What does it look like to mortify sin? Guys don't think through those things anymore. And so yeah, I'd recommend pick up Surviving the Trenches. We even have a whole program that you can do, you and your friends, uh, walking through that book together and walking through Romans 6 together in tandem with that. So y'all seek that out. And then look, we're going to continue on this journey of figuring out what does it mean to be a man. And so we're going to continue reading some books together, discussing it, putting it out there. And y'all feel free to send in some book recommendations. We have gotten a couple already, so we'll see what we do with those. But yeah, we'll see you next time on the Cross Training Ministries podcast.